a 2-minute overview of the EdTech Evidence Exchange, why we exist and what we are building. We exist because our nation's education system is fragmented into more than 13,000 school districts that collectively spend more than $20 billion per year on EdTech, without understanding what works, where, why, or under what conditions. Our schools lack access to this information in part because of what economists call a collective action problem. Every school wishes that every other school would carefully document and share their experiences with EdTech, including lessons learned the hard way. But each individual school lacks the incentive to do that work itself. And as a result, the information we all need to make better decisions remains trapped in the heads of hundreds of thousands of educators. As a result, our school districts struggle to make effective decisions about which technologies to procure and how to most effectively implement them. A frustrating consequence of this dysfunction is that approximately 75% of all education technology appears to be either substantially underused or unused entirely. This is both inexcusable and fixable. Absent government regulations requiring schools to thoughtfully document and share what they are learning, our best hope is to give schools and individual educators strong positive incentives to document for the common good what they are experiencing. With the support of philanthropy, the EdTech Evidence Exchange was born for the purpose of building a system to give educators the incentives and support they need to thoroughly document their experiences with education technology so that we can all learn from each other. This spring, we will be launching version 1.0 of our EdTech Evidence Exchange platform, through which we will begin to pay cash stipends to thousands of educators who carefully document their work using the new instruments developed through our sector-wide EdTech Genome Project and in partnership with our research team at the University of Virginia. And now, on to the show. Pedro Noguera is a national leader on researching, advocating for, and building a more equitable, just, and quality education system. He is currently serving as Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education and co-writing or co-writing 15 books, including his latest collaboration with Rick Hess, which is coming out March 5th, and is titled A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K-12 Education. Pedro, we're all eager to hear your voice, and I'm so grateful that you've joined us for our first virtual roundtable. Rick Hess has been a leading voice in the national conversation on education for a long time. He wears many hats, including his leadership role at AEI, his prolific writing, which includes the popular Rick Hess Straight Up blog at EdWeek, and he has taught at the University of Virginia and Harvard University, just to mention a few. Thank you, Rick, for joining us today. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to be with you.
I loved your book. I hope you're working on a sequel. And I'd like to start by asking you, as students return to the classroom throughout this calendar year, what role do you think education technology could and should play in supporting students, especially those who have fallen so far behind? What are the keys to doing this successfully?
Dean, I'll defer to you.
He's muted.
Okay.
And now
I'm unmuted. They wouldn't allow me to unmute myself. So, so I'm sorry. So I missed the question trying to unmute. One more
That's
time.
okay. I'll give it to you again.
Okay.
As students return to the classroom this year, what role do you think education technology could and should play in supporting students, especially those who have fallen so far behind? What are the keys to doing this most successfully?
You know, I think we've seen that there's a lot of potential for ed technology during this period. We've had to go on to virtual learning so quickly. And we know that some kids have really benefited. Many have not. and because they need to be in person. But I do think that there's clearly a role it can play in supplementing and personalizing learning for lots of kids. And it's already been used that way. Now I think the potential to serve many more that way is there. I don't think that, I always get worried that we'll treat it as a kind of panacea that can do everything. And I think that's a mistake, especially with kids, younger kids, kids with special needs. But I think with very targeted role, it can be a real resource for education.
Yeah, what I'll just add is for me, and it's always a question of what are the acts of teaching and learning? When you think about them, there's a huge number of things that educators do in a day, that students do in a classroom or a learning environment. And some of these things, there is no substitute for the human touch, the hand on the shoulder, the voice in the ear. There's a lot of things, though, which actually technology allows us to do for kids. And it gives them more shots at iterating on a formative assessment. At a teacher getting more feedback points. It lets a kid practice something more in real time. So for me, the key question, especially when we're thinking about catching up kids who've lost huge amounts of learning time and huge amounts of social and emotional development, is how do we think about the technology as complementing what it is educators and schools do, so that educators can spend more time doing the stuff where they're have a particularly powerful impact. And we can use technology to give kids more reps and more opportunities to do the things that they need more
of. Sorry, Pedro got muted again. Ivy, if you could unmute him.
Thank you. I would just add, I'm still waiting for the gamer to produce a real learning game, right? That is compelling as Minecraft and the kind of games kids want to entertain themselves with, but where they're really learning things that are valuable, they're going to be useful for them later. I know my own daughter, she relies a lot on games just for social interaction with her friends who are all over the world. But I question sometimes how much she's actually learning from these games.
I read a really interesting book called The Game Believes in You, written by Greg Topo, was the USA Today education reporter, which I commend to all. Talks about how kids can benefit from using the gaming philosophy of, my kids play Fortnite and Apex Legends and they'll get killed 30 times trying to accomplish something, but they'll give up on one polynomial. So I hear you loud and clear there. Let's talk about implementation, because so much of what matters is how these tools are properly used to support great teaching and learning. Pedro, in your book, you mentioned that implementation is where things get messy and sometimes fall apart, and that school leaders often pay insufficient attention to school culture issues, for example, when it comes to implementing new programs. So when it comes to the implementation of new programs and practices in our schools, both technological and non-technological, what are you seeing that our schools are doing right and wrong? And which implementation factors seem to be most important?
Yeah, one of the things that really has bothered me so long is we can all identify promising practices that work in certain places, research that shows us why it works, how it works, and then we see lots of examples where it's being done poorly. And then people will point to that and say, well, it's proof it doesn't work. But it's proof that you didn't do it right, that it wasn't implemented with fidelity, that it wasn't implemented correctly. And Richard and I share a friend who just passed away, Richard Elmore from Harvard, who was very focused on what we would call problems of practice, which really have to do with implementation of teaching and learning. And I think we're not good at that yet, because that's where the human dynamic, right, the teacher with all their flaws of personality, and the student who also comes with their temperament and personality, how do you make that work? And that is, the curriculum is hopefully the connector that facilitates the learning, but you still have to deal with issues of motivation, of, so many other issues that affect learning that make it difficult. So I think implementation, we can never eliminate the human element because we're dealing with human beings, and that's where it becomes challenging.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Pedro referenced Dick Elmore, who famously wrote a quarter century ago a piece called the Trouble of Getting to Scale, or the Problem of Getting to Scale. That we have this habit, we find these wonderful little pilots, and then we say, great, we've cracked the code. It's kind of like Ron Edmonds in the effective schools research of 35 years ago and 40 years ago now. And we say, we know what works, and then we try to carry it somewhere and it doesn't work. And we say, what went wrong? Well, it turns out what went wrong is often that we have an exquisitely narrow vision of what it is at working. We say we liked the tech, or we liked the training for the teachers, but we forget that it was brought to a place where teachers opted in, where there was a memoranda of understanding that created an opportunity to learn this in 6 weeks in a ramp up. That the kids who are participating are choosing to be at this school so that they and their parents are invested, that they're getting a lot of tender loving care from whatever professor dreamed this up somewhere because the professor's using it as a test case. So what happens is when we talk about a pilot program being successful, we often have a way of defining down what it was that made it successful, which is why we're constantly surprised that one after another of these things doesn't travel. And instead of learning the lesson that, wait a minute, we're thinking about this all wrong, we decide, well, that wasn't the right solution. Therefore, we're going to go to a conference next year and get a different kind of solution. And what we wind up is frustrating the living hell out of the educators who get stuck in the middle of this.
Rick, in your book, you discussed evaluating the results of the small schools movement, which you say produced some great small schools, but plenty of lousy ones too. And you say that we need to understand which factors made it possible for some of the new schools to be successful. Following on the previous topic, if numerous schools followed the same small schools blueprint, what explains the variation in their results? Were the blueprints insufficiently detailed? Did their contexts vary?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's funny. So for instance, folks may remember Tom Toke did a book 20 years ago called High Schools on a Human Scale about the efforts in New York City to do this. Famous, made Julia Richmond complex famous. And when you read the accounts of the schools, it's always about the leadership and the dynamism of the principal and all the things that we just mentioned in the last answer, the MOUs and the extra support and the foundation funding kind of fall to the background. And so I think what we tend to do is there's a laundry list of variables. And because we can only process so much, we tend to focus on the variables that feel like the ones that are part of the recipe and set the others aside. So yeah, I think it's a lot of the things that shape whether or not the community, the school community, the faculty, the kids, the parents are receptive to what's going on, whether people feel like they've opted into this. Great way to think about this is every year, in a place like Texas, there's a high school football coach who comes up with some offense, which lights things up. Or a college coach will do this. Or in Indiana, it's a basketball coach. Or it's a debate coach somewhere, and everybody says, oh, let's do that. But you don't actually see the same results manifest in lots of the places. Why? It's because it turns out it's not just the X's and O's. It's not just the words that you're using. It's all of these embedded kind of infrastructural factors into which these things are getting set. And we've had huge incentives, practitioners, the folks designing and selling this stuff, the foundations underwriting it and marketing it, and promoting it and marketing it. All of these folks have had a huge kind of professional, emotional incentive to focus on the handful of things they can control and to kind of not worry too much about all of this inconvenient background noise.
So I'm hearing context matters, which makes me happy because that's our hashtag. And I'm hearing things like teacher agency, professional development, school culture, community buy-in being very important factors. Pedro, are there other factors that come to mind in your experience that influence the success or failure of new programs?
Yeah, the size of the classroom, for example, we don't know what is the optimal class size, but I know for sure once you put over 30 kids in a room, unless they're all super high achievers that need very little teacher support, usually class size is a problem. But we also know that there are lots of unmet needs kids are bringing to school, and everything from hunger to health needs to lack of stable housing. Those impact learning too. And that is, I think, the bigger issue in America, that when we look at issues of poverty and inequality, that's where the Achilles heel lies. I mean, we have a lot of mediocre schools and lots of some pretty good schools, but very few of them are in poor communities. In poor communities where conditions in schools are usually suboptimal and the needs in the community are greater, what we see are teachers who are overwhelmed, and there's no technology that can cure that. So I think we have to look in the right place for solutions to those kinds of problems.
Well, that brings up a great transition. You served on the Berkeley School Board, and in the book, you wrote about how you were shocked to learn that the district had a school, Emerson Elementary, that had the same demographics as other schools in Berkeley, but its low-income Black and Latino kids were consistently outperforming their peers at other schools. And you wrote that your question to the superintendent was, why didn't the other schools learn from Emerson's success? I was wondering if you could share with us what the superintendent said, and were those schools ever able to learn from their peers, or did they have exogenous factors that made it more difficult for them? And why do you think we collectively have such a hard time learning from schools like Emerson?
Yeah, to a large degree, the fault lied with the superintendent, right? That is, she had not created the opportunities for the educators to learn from each other. Each school is its own entity. Each classroom is its own entity. Unless you give the teachers the chance to observe each other, again, something Richard Elmore taught us was important for teachers to look at each other's practice, but then to debrief about what they're seeing. That doesn't happen systematically in schools. And so we'll see one classroom where excellent teaching and learning is going on, right next door, not happening. School around the corner, it's just, we don't know how to make it possible for educators to learn from each other on a systematic basis. Again, Richard Dick Elmore is on my mind because he just died. He instituted in District 2 in New York City, the East Side, a practice, what we call instructional rounds, borrowed from healthcare, where teachers will go out and visit each other's classrooms and talk about what they saw as a way to elevate, both to identify effective practice and elevate them so others could at least attempt to use them. It really helps to see good practice at work. And that, I think, is missing from a lot of the work we do in education.
Although, and just to piggyback on that, although one pathology here is we take an idea like instructional rounds, which makes a lot of intuitive sense, and school districts, because they are public bureaucracies, say, wait a minute, we have trouble with discretion. So what we need to do is create a role that we can write a job description around, get the board to approve, qualify for title funding. And so we create instructional coaches. So rather than actually having figure out how to have flexibility where teachers are learning from one another, we create somebody where you pull an effective teacher ideally out of their classroom, so they're no longer teaching any kids. They then wander around, and when you actually do focus groups with teachers about the instructional coaches, they tend to feel frustrated and intruded and spied upon. And then these instructional coaches spend half of their time serving as substitute teachers or proctors for state assessments. So what happens is, rather than taking these kinds of intuitions and saying, how do we create a learning environment? What we do is we use them to add new payroll with new benefit obligations, create new bureaucratic strictures, and then increase the general level of inefficacy and frustration.
Finally, some disagreement, you guys.
I don't know that Pedro, would you disagree too much with that?
I don't disagree at all with that. I think it's just another way of talking about it. Yeah, I think we're on the same page. But I think this is where a lot of the debates in education are meaningless. When it comes to understanding practice, then you have to deal with the complexity of teaching and learning. That's what's been missing from so much of the policy debates in education over the last 20 years. We haven't talked about teaching and learning. We've talked around it. You know, we reduced learning to how well a kid did on standardized tests. And then we want to judge the teacher based on what the score was, which is ludicrous. Anybody who understands teaching and learning knows that there's so many factors influencing student learning. And so anyway, we could debate that too.
Well, let's move on to assessments, because you guys spend a fair amount of time in your book lamenting our nation's obsession with high-stakes summative tests that provide frustratingly little actionable intelligence for teachers. Rick points out that when medical doctors prescribe tests, there's almost always a direct link between the test results and the doctor's ability to treat illness. My question for you, gentlemen, is why is our education sector so far behind other sectors of our economy when it comes to the use of formative and real-time assessment? What role can or should technology play here, and what type of policy changes might we need?
Well, you know, for me, the key issue here is, look, 20 years ago, NCLB and even 30 years ago, the accountability movement grew out of a reasonable question, which was, if you were a taxpayer or a parent or a policymaker, there was no earthly way to get any kind of reasonable sense of how schools were faring. So, you know, whether we're talking about Improving America's Schools Act in '94 or the intuition driving NCLB, a lot of sympathy. I think that was entirely justifiable. What's happened, though, is because of the way the policy got framed, is we wound up with a testing apparatus which has mostly been created for the convenience of policymakers. We've wound up with simple numbers which you can use to score schools and systems and to disaggregate populations that you can talk about in state legislatures or in Washington, D.C. We did not wind up with a system which is actually designed to provide timely, useful, instructional, relevant, real-time data to help people in schools actually help kids learn better. When you think about how you do assessment and accountability, for instance, in most organizations, in the private sector, for-profit or nonprofit, the emphasis is not collecting stuff for the annual report in most well-run ventures. It is collecting stuff that helps you do your job better the next day. That is not how we have invested. It's not how we've talked about testing. It's not how we have framed testing. And as a consequence, the energy and investment in assessment and education has been dominated by stuff which is much more focused on the annual report and federal mandates than it was on actually helping kids learn or teachers teach. And for, I think, one of the places Pedro and I are on the same page is we need to recalibrate that assessment. And the problem is it's gotten caught up in a debate between people who are testing hawks and people who are anti-testing. And for me, that's the wrong question. The question is, how do you actually test in ways that help schools do what they're supposed to do?
So, and I would just add, there's a lot of concerns about the validity of the assessments themselves. Do they assess what kids have actually been taught, for example, which would be important to know, or do they assess what we think kids should have learned, right? Those are two different things. Then there's the question of how do we use the assessments? And this, to Rick's point, if you look at Toronto, and Toronto is a relatively high-performing urban district, in fact, probably the highest performing in North America. When they see a school has low scores, that's a sign a school needs help. And they send in educators who have expertise in the areas that the kids are struggling in, because they know that if the kids are struggling in math, it probably means that teachers are struggling at teaching it. So they send math coaches to work with those teachers. But it's not punitive, it's helpful. And that, I think, is a very different way of thinking about using assessment to drive improvement over time. We don't do that in the United States. We can tell a kid you're low, we can tell a school you're failing. We don't know what to do to help that school improve.
And just, you know, and one point which takes us slightly, which is consistent with Pedro saying, but takes another direction, is look, the simplest way I would split this is we have spent little or no time talking about assessing things other than reading and math in any serious way. The investment in how do you actually assess in civics, in social studies, in science, in world languages is abysmal. And that's because the energy, and you know, we can have thoughtful conversations about what kind of reading and math assessments are most useful, and how do we think about the distinction between formal state assessments end of year versus real time or interim or tracking assessments. But the key point here is we have invested in certain kinds of assessment and not in others. And the kinds we've invested in have been the kind that are more useful to policymakers than the kinds that are actually useful to students and their educators.
Well, we could go on for a long time, and I very, very much appreciate the thought that has gone into writing your book and thinking about these positions as we discussed beforehand. I would love to see, and many of us would like to see, the two of you agree on some specific policy proposals and recommendations that we as a country should consider. There's a lot of problems with assessments. I think one of the points that Pedro made is we don't do a very good job of assessing how ready to learn students are, what their home environments are and what their needs are, so that they can be fed and safe and ready to learn alongside their peers. I'd like to thank you both for taking your time to share your insights with us today. This is the first of our short and sweet lunchtime on the East Coast, breakfast on the West Coast, roundtables. I really encourage everyone to pick up their book when it comes out on March 5th. You guys really set a sparkling example of how two people with very different philosophical and political viewpoints can engage in a thoughtful discussion and debate. I also want to thank Ivy Misson and Dan Brown from the EdTech Evidence Exchange and the teams at USC and AEI for making today's event possible. There's been lots of good questions in the chat. We will share the chat contents and aggregate some of the questions, and maybe Rick and Pedro can answer a few of those questions on social media or on their blogs at some point. But we are out of time for now. So I'll give the last word to Rick and Pedro on final thoughts that we should keep in mind as we recover from the pandemic.
You know,
just say, Bart, you gave us a good charge of trying to summarize our points of agreement, because I think we didn't do that, Rick. So
no, that's right. So it's you know, something to grow on. The other thing is, Bart, one thing you'd flagged in a possible question is like one book that folks might want to check out. I think, but maybe the most useful book I've read in the last 20 years on this was Charles Payne wrote a book called So Much Reform, So Little Change about 15 years ago, which if you haven't had the pleasure to check it out, is just, I think, a phenomenal look at some of these challenges.
Great. Well, that's it. You're all free to go. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you in a couple months.